Hi all, I have another absolutely fascinating game from the World Championship Candidates tournament to show you. So in round 13, unlucky for some or lucky for some, Kasparov's favourite number anyway, 13. So Fabiano Caruana against Levon Aronian. Let's see this game. So e4 from Fabiano. We have e5, knight f3, knight c6, Roy Lopez. So one of the most trodden, well-researched openings in chess history. What could possibly be surprising in the early moves? So far, pretty standard. Bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, black castles. And it used to be the most trodden path was always c3, accepting the kind of possibility of the Marshall Gambit, the dreaded Marshall Gambit. But since the Marshall Gambit is thought to be really quite good, and for example British Grandmaster Michael Adams uses it to at least draw most of the time against other Super GMs, a load of other moves in recent years have appeared as anti-Marshall systems. In this game we saw d3, but there's also h3, a4, d4. These are all quite popular as well as an alternative to c3. But in this game, yeah, we see the anti-Marshall move d3. So the c3 square isn't used up. So the Marshall Gambit isn't as dangerous here because of the subtle little differences. So we see black actually playing d6, the more reserved d6 move. So Roy Lopez closed. Now here is a really interesting move in this position. Black has just supported the e5 pawn. If you're a total beginner and you didn't have any notion of opening theory, you might really consider this next move as a basic premise in addressing the opponent's threat, which is knight a5. If black had on the move knight a5 to grab your light square bishop. And the conventional method of handling this is to actually tuck the bishop away with c3. For example, c3, knight a5, bishop c2. So it is kind of handling that in a way, but black gets to push the c pawn after unblocking. In this game, what's curious for me from a theoretical perspective, from an opening theory evolution perspective, is actually the move bishop d2. This is one of like the top 5 engine choices on my latest version of Houdini. Actually, I'm saying that because these top engine choices, there's a mismatch in that list of priority moves here between this and Libra. It does seem to address the threat of knight a5. There does seem to be a basic fundamental logic that if you weren't biased, you would actually consider another way of parrying the knight a5 threats, just to play bishop d2. So it looks really quite quirky and interesting to me. And yeah, this mismatch between the top engine moves and the live book moves, I think they were ignored if you go back a few years, because engines can't see that far into the future. So it was thought that humans would do the best opening books. But I think there is an increasing challenge on our standard opening books, and this kind of move, yeah, is actually interesting to explore and to find out the right continuations and what exactly the poison is with this move. It's fascinating. So bishop d2, a kind of novelty in a really well-trodden, ancient, well-trodden system in the Roy Lopez. Okay, anti-Marshall lines though with d3 are less explored in general. So anyway, bishop d2. So maybe Aronian is already a little bit concerned by this. So bishop g4 was played. There might be other waiting moves. One of the issues with bishop g4 is that the bishop, if it goes to g6, is going to be kind of stranded. That's a really interesting thing. Bishops going to g6, there are lines where white just can celebrate that and cement a knight on f5. So this is, if it's going to g6 later, it might be a little bit stranded. If we look at this position and look at rook e8, then white does have the opportunity to play h3 to stop any pin. And if we get this position, white can even play this move, which is a little benefit of c3. The bishop doesn't have to tuck away on c2 like a huddling, like usually. It can stay on this quite dangerous diagonal with a3. And in fact, with the c3 square vacant, that parking slot vacant, a knight can even use that. So we get different continuation. But that's going to be a really big challenge. These new moves appearing, worthy of consideration. We would really need to find out the finesses of all the upsides that they present. But this is an example which is, it seems like a really quite potentially a comfortable position for white. Pretty unexplored territory. Okay, but in this game anyway, we see bishop g4 in this position, not rook e8. So we have c3 now. So it's kind of mixing ideas now, because now, hasn't this been neutralized? Now there's knight a5, isn't there? So you might think this is just really weird. Why bishop d2 then c3? Well, actually, okay, there is a subtle difference. Bishop g4 has been provoked. So if knight a5, we do have already a different little perk that the bishop's on g4. We can hit that, and yeah, black can actually consider not going to g6, but going this way, going backwards to d7. This shouldn't be such a big deal. This kind of position shouldn't be such a big deal for white. No one's played any kind of irreversible decision. The bishop going to g6 is a kind of irreversible decision in a way. So both sides can stay pretty flexible if they're prepared to do moves which look pretty counterintuitive. Okay, so bishop e3. Sorry. So in this game, we have actually in this position now, instead of knight a5, which is available, we have d5. So using the fact that the knight's pinned, there's no Marshall Gambit consequence, there's no e5 pawn droppings of that pin. Now we have h3. Now the bishop maintains this relative pin on the queen. If it breaks that pin, then yeah, e5 is going to be exposed. Knight takes d5. I'm thinking of Suits when I say exposed nowadays. There's a, yeah, check it out on Netflix. So yeah, e5 is exposed there. So the pin is maintained with bishop h5 here, but the bishop is going to kind of a committal place potentially on g6. Worthy of consideration maybe to actually play bishop c8. I mean, here it might not actually be that bad, this position, as it's not such a bad from a counterplay point of view. White has technically apparently a small edge, so this is an interesting gambit position as well. So anyway, the bishop does commit back to going back to a potentially trappable, I mean, sort of immobile place. We have queen e2, rook b8, now bishop g5, and now black commits, again, a kind of irreversible decision. D takes e4. D takes e4. Black's released that central tension. What does that mean exactly, that black's released the central tension? Sometimes it's bad to do this, basically because often when you release tension, you're giving your opponent a free hand to do something, because you've lost the ability to nag them at the possibility of, for example, D takes e4 all the time. The nagging has gone. You know, the wife has been sent away. Little joke, sorry. Okay, so the nagging has gone in the center. So anyway, so h6 is played, and white is pretty witty here with his bishop in this game. It's got to be said. This is probably Caruana's finest hour with this bishop. He doesn't go here because the bishop would suffer the same in like that one. You know, being on g3 might not be brilliant. I'll give you an example. Knight d7, challenging the bishop. If the bishop's preserved on g3, bishop d6, this position, knight c5, you can see the knight's hitting the bishop here. If that wants to be preserved, the knight c6, you can see f4. This is at least even position. Bishop's not doing a great deal on h2. It's better here, isn't it, pointing at h6 to be able to at least threaten bishop takes h6. So the bishop actually drops back to c1. This is really quite a witty game, I've got to say, from Caruana. And, you know, the backdrop of this is, these are novelties in an ancient opening. It's like Rome is crumbling, Rome being our opening theory, it's crumbling to the challenges of our technology. You know, these ideas are very nuanced, very new ideas. So bishop c1, if the bishop had gone here, then there's knight takes e4. That's perfectly okay. And the bishop goes here. It's a bit poxy, actually, on d2. I think queen c8, it's not as good. You want to use d2 for the knight sometimes. So bishop c1 has some advantages. Parking spaces are very important to consider. d2 is a good parking space for the knight. So bishop g6. The bishop is in a kind of irreversible place here. This parking spot's used to support the pawn. Knight h5. Black's trying to do something, but, you know, he's released the tension in the center. Knight f1. Black doesn't really want to play knight f4 now. If he does play knight f4, White can just take that. And bishop d5. This position is a small edge for White. So Black really doesn't want to lose that outpost square. Bishop c5. He starts to play quite aggressively, as though pointing things at White's king for a moment. g3 takes away the f4 square from the knight. The knight's holding g3, so this pawn's pinned though. Both sides' pawns here are pinned, so they might want to unpin soon. Another possibility though, instead of g3, apparently this is a good idea, and White has a small edge. So actually maybe it's not such a big deal about knight f4. It's as if g3's underlined it as a big deal, but, you know, there is just plonking the knight on g4 here. So anyway, g3, king h7, unpinning the f7 pawn. King g2, unpinning the f2 pawn. Queen e7, bishop c2. This is really quite nifty, bishop c2. You can see this part of the pawn chain is underminable with a4, but to maximize the effectiveness of that, you'd rather like to fix this pawn first, and bishop c2 means that the pawn on b5 can be fixed with b4 later, and then a4, which activates for free this rook, which hasn't even moved. It's like everything's coming to this rook without even moving, potentially after b4 and a4, wrecking this queenside pawn chain. So that's a really dangerous positional threat. The queen on e2 means the pawn's pinned to a6, by the way. So there's no b4 because there's queen takes a6. So Black's going to be potentially frozen and hit on the queen side soon. Rook fd8, b4 freezing the b5 pawn, and now a4 hit on the queen side. Yeah. Knight f6 is played now, and now we have knight h4. You know, this pawn can potentially be taken in some of the variations, but Caruana didn't want to get involved in those complications just yet. These pawns are not going anywhere. We see queen e6, and actually he just piles on the pressure on this little pawn chain, and maybe trying to cause a little bit of a panic from Black that he's just going to lose his queen side soon. So taking on a4 doesn't really help things. White could just take here. Take on a6, and this pawn's pretty weak. So for example, this White has a big advantage. So Black's getting into a kind of position where he's been run out of counterplay potentially. So bishop h5, and this is Black's quest for a bit of counterplay here. We see g4. The bishop's going to go back to this imprisonment or not. No. We see bishop takes g4, sacrificing a piece to release some piece power at least. So there's a hit on f2 here. The queen's responsible for the bishop, so it's a little bit awkward, this position. We have knight f5, just offering the f2 pawn. Yeah, it's a little bit tricky here for what to do. There is also the possibility sometimes of the queen being dangerous. So knight f5 was chosen, and we have knight takes f2, picking up another pawn. we have the bishop dropping back, which is simple and strong in a way. Yeah, the bishop was hit because of the rook and knight. G6. Now white should try and avoid taking on h3. Can you see what black can do here? If I give you 5 seconds. This didn't happen in the game, funny enough. Okay, queen h3 check, yeah. And then queen h1 checkmate. That's to be avoided. Now, actually here though, this one went to e3, knight 1 to e3, not knight 5 to e3. In fact, knight 5 to e3, because it interrupts, the knight is actually possible without getting mated. Because if queen h3, we can just take care. So this is actually possible and pretty strong, actually, knight 5 to e3. Not counter-sacking a piece. For example, knight h3, which looks dangerous because of knight f4, but knight d5 covers things, and white's in the driving seat there. f4's covered, g4's covered. This is good for white, but white actually chose the other knight to sacrifice the f5 knight, which wrenches open this diagonal a bit more. It liberates this bishop a bit more. So it's kind of a very aggressive piece sacrifice, counter piece sacrifice. In fact, on move 29 here, technically a5 is also pretty strong, where, yeah, apparently this is pretty good as well. If the bishop, yeah, there's different possibilities anyway. So anyway, let's not get into that. Knight 1 e3, black takes that. And at move 29 here, though, there is something already emerging as interesting. This possibility, so knight takes b4, g takes. This possibility is emerging. It's not quite on the radar yet, but it's something to be factored in. Knight takes b4. This is a really fascinating tactical possibility. So just watch out for it soon, though. Okay, this forcing move. Knight takes b4. E takes f5. Queen f6. Queen takes f2. And now black plays e4, which does give the e5 square. So it seems like an activating move to generate some more piece play. But already, look at this move again, which we saw on the radar. Knight takes b4 here. What does it do? Rook d4. It means, this is really interesting, because it's apparently Levon Aronian didn't even consider this. But there is something, I think, really super cool about this idea, just from a philosophical perspective. It's that both rooks are simultaneously generating threats. It's like having a parallel processor, basically. This rook has got the threat of rook f4, and this one's got the threat of rook g8. Without knight takes b4, there's no parallel processing here of the rooks. Because you can see that, because there's no actual entry point at all on this d file, this rook can't generate threats. But by doing this, both rooks are independently generating threats. So it's a fantastic mechanism to be tactically aware of when you can get both rooks simultaneously doing threats instead of just one. Because otherwise it's just basically the g8 square. But here it becomes, yeah, this fifth rank switch. So that's a really fascinating thing which is on the radar here, even at this moment of move 31. Absolutely fascinating. But e4 was slipped in. Rook h1. In fact, bishop takes e4 was actually possible without any major punishments, because check is only using one rook, right? And here there's no major entry point possibility. This position, for example, white's doing fine. So the parallel processing of the rooks is something maybe to tactically consider in our own games. So this game can help evolve opening theory and tactical understanding as well so far. quite a major game. Yeah, so e4. The bishop could have taken, but we have rook h1, and it's here. If black's to have any chance, he actually. I think it, sorry. Yeah, instead of e4, it was. Yeah, it was here instead of e4. Knight takes b4 here, and then rook d4. Let's have a look at this position. So king. What is going on in this particular position without e4? Well, there's the threat of rook g8 sometimes, the king going on the h file sometimes and just getting mated. So, for example, king h3, because there's also a threat of queen g5 check here. So say king h3, this looks weird. Queen g5, and it looks as though if black can play rook g8 to cut down the king, then there'll be queen h5 threats. f6 checks here, for example, this position starts to get really like a total mess. It starts to get absolutely, this is a total chaos variation, basically. Just showing it. It's just chaos, but apparently it ends up being equal here, technically equal. I mean, there are many interesting variations from this knight takes b4 in this position. It's a fascinating move, I think, tactically. Let's go to this position again. Move 32 in the variations. If bishop b2, for example, just to show the dangers. Well, check. This would be this is just crazy stuff. Apparently equal, but why would you want to walk the king to e4? No human would do this stuff. 33 knight d5, which would cover the g5 square, giving back a piece. This position is apparently going to be about equal, but there are very dangerous possibilities for white as well, where the king really gets in trouble. So yeah, this is just a really fascinating possibility instead of e4. Knight takes b4. Let me just show you. There's another variation down here. C takes b4. Rook d4. Rook h1. Rook f4. This shows the real dangers of both rooks working in parallel. If the queen's hit and goes here, for example, rook g8 check, king h3, and brutalized rook h4 checkmate. Yeah, you think, look at these pieces, they're all kind of spectator pieces scenario. This bishop's hemmed in by its own pawn. Yeah, it's just getting the both rooks working in parallel to create independent threats. So it's, as a tactical theme, this is probably worthy of study, this tactic in its own right. It's a fascinating idea to just get this, rip open a key central switching point square for a rook and leaving the other rook in reserve to use that g8 square. Fascinating. But anyway, it was missed. So e4, which limits basically black's counterplay because there's only this g file. The rooks are not working parallel. We have rook h1, and white's in the driving seat again quite comfortably now. Rook d6 is played. Bishop takes e4. Rook g8 check. King f1. The entry points are covered, you see. Look at this knight covering. Or rather, there's always king e2 and bishop takes h1 if the check. King e2, it's a bit harmless. Rook d1, so king e2. You don't have to take here and lose the queen, just play this. And here we can take with the bishop. So there's no effective entry points, I should say. Knight e5 is played. And now white goes in for like attacking prospects with queen f4. And actually there's a very big threat here because queen f4 unpins this knight. You see that unpinning of the knight? This knight can actually potentially go to d5 now. If the queen moves, then there's f6 check. So it's all exploding in the black king, at the black king after knight d5. So that really, I think we've seen this big threat in another game earlier, where black has to stop a piece coming to d5. Black played c6 here to stop knight d5. If I'll give you another example, knight d3, bishop takes. Here, knight g4 is dangerous instead. And for example, rook takes h6 check. It's crushing. White has a big advantage here. So yeah, it's logical. It seems black has to stop knight d5 now after this unpinning of that knight on e3. So c6. Now black's queenside is in meltdown here after a takes b5. Black didn't bother recapturing. If he recaptures, I think king e2 is nice and very comfortable. And anyway, black decided to play rook g5. We have b takes a6. I know there's a potentially winning pawn in its own right over here now, as well as this potentially menacing kingside breakthrough. Queen d8. I know there's a knight hanging here now. There's all sorts of very, very good winning moves for white in this position. It looks as though, you know, this entry point on d1 is being underlined potentially, but here just f6 check, disregarding the possibility of taking the knight, and in fact letting the black rook protect the knight, because this is fatal for black in any case here, swapping this possibility for more menacing possibilities. Knight g6 going into a pin. Can you see what white played here? Well, if the king went back, then there's just rook takes h6, and say rook g6, then actually queen takes e5 is absolutely is very, very good. Okay, there's all sorts of possibilities around here. In the game, okay, so knight g6 was played. White's play here. If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, what would you play in this position? Okay, rook takes h6, breaks through on the king side. Now, if the king moves, then queen takes g5, and there's nothing really for black at all. So the game actually ended here, because if king takes, there's two ways, at least two ways of white getting an absolutely massive advantage. Knight g4 check, using the pin, is great. For example, here, just taking the rook. If check, king e2, end the game, and black's not really up to anything. And there's also, just showing how strong the position is, there's also another possibility here of playing queen h2 check. Even though it allows rook h5, there's knight f5 double check, driving the king back. Queen takes h5, and white's just scooping up loads of material. Or yeah, this absolutely crushing forcing sequence. Knight e7 check, queen h7 check, queen h8 check, queen g7 check, picking up the knight, queen takes f7, and the pawn's ready for a checkmate over here. If king c8, then there's queen b7 checkmate. So the queen would have to win the post. Yeah, and yeah, we don't have to go much further. But okay, yeah, so it's absolutely devastating by this point of rook takes h6 when the game ended. Let's just go back to that point. Let's rewind. Yeah, so rook takes h6, game ending. So it puts Caruana in a fantastic position now to win the whole candidates. After this game, he's like half point ahead of the field with only one round to go, in round 14, I believe. So really good position to win the candidates tournament. Really interesting game. And actually, Caruana did seem to be aware of the kind of irreversible properties of the position. So I think it's really cool the way he played this. Really impressive game. It seems as though Black did have the possibility of counterplay, but it's really subtle stuff. These resources that computers really see. It's really subtle, amazing stuff. Knight takes b4, but it's so easy for humans to miss that sort of stuff, especially if you've already invested material, to invest more material as well. It's a big ask. So anyway, fascinating game, I thought, to analyse. There's a big wealth of variations, of course, which you can get drowned literally in the variations of these games. But anyway, I hope to have shown you some of the key ones, and some interesting insights in opening theory and tactics generally, perhaps. Okay, comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks so much.